Hello and welcome to this section on static methods and properties. So let's understand what are static methods and property and how to use them. So these are the lecture objectives. After completing section, you will be able to understand what is static methods and properties. You will be able to define and access static methods and how to access the static properties. We'll understand a keyword called self with double colons. We'll understand what is the purpose of it. Then you'll understand what is the real life use case of a static method and properties. Then we'll work with exercises, resources, assignments, and quiz to understand static methods and properties. Okay, so let's jump into the lecture and understand what are static methods and properties. Welcome to the lecture on what is static methods and property. So let's understand what are static methods. When you want to access class methods or properties without an instance, then they are marked as static. Well, this is one of the important concepts in OOPs, and you will see when you try to access some of the methods without an instance, the reason behind it because the methods or properties are marked as static. So when you mark them as static, you are actually telling the class that I want to access this method and a property without the object. Earlier we said we want to define a class which is a blueprint of an object, and using object you can access the property and the method of a class. But if you don't want to create an instance of a class, but you still want to access those methods and the properties, you define them as static. Okay, that is the purpose of having a static method and static properties. Method and properties that are marked as static so that it can be accessed with class name directly. You don't need an instance, you don't need to create an object. Just with the class name you can access the method and the property. And this is the scope resolution operator, double colon, which is colon and colon. This is called as scope resolution operator. Okay, and it is used to access static method and a property with a class name. An example could be a car class actually have an apply break method, and you want to access the method without creating instance. So for that you make apply break as a static method and you use the car class with scope resolution operator and call the static method or a static property. Let's understand this with an example. So here's an example. You have a class car and you have one property called name, and then you have a function called apply break. Static is basically a keyword. When applied to method or properties, make them accessible without the instance. You can apply this keyword static to a property name, or you can apply static to a function. Okay, when you apply this keyword static, it can be accessed without an instance. That's what we have been discussing. When you mention property and a method as static, you can see the notation here with the class name. The car is basically the class name, then the scope resolution operator, which is colon and colon. Then you can directly access the property, and then you can use the same notation to access the method. Okay, so let's do an example and understand how to create static methods and properties and how to access them. Hello and welcome to the lecture on how to define and access static method and static properties. So let's create a folder here and call it static. Then we'll create a file. Static methods example. And let's define a class. And let's define a calculator class. In the calculator class, we will define one property and a method. And the property we can say as result, where we'll store the calculation result. And then we'll define a function called add. Okay, and then we'll say result is equal to. Okay, so let's return the result. Okay, and now we will try to access that result, which is equal to add. So we'll call the class and then we'll call the method directly. So we are using its property and we are using its method. Okay, now you can echo the result. Okay, you can even use the add method here. You can say 2, 5, 4. Okay, so let's run this. And one thing you cannot do is basically you cannot use this anywhere. You cannot do this. Can you guess why you cannot do this? Do you know why we cannot use this? The reason behind this is an instance of a class, and because it is static, you don't have an instance for it. Okay, static methods and static properties can be accessed without an instance. So there's no instance here, and they are not referred with an instance. You can see we are using the scope resolution operator. We are not using an instance here, right? We haven't created like this calculator is equal to new calculator. We haven't done this because this is an instance of a class. So instead of that, we have directly used the class, and using scope resolution operator we are trying to access its properties and also access its methods. Okay, so you have to mention a $sign here just to refer to that variable. Okay, so let's run this. So that's the output coming up from your result. 1 + 2 3 and 2 + 4 is 6. Okay, so that's how you basically access a static property and a static method via the scope resolution operator. And remember, we don't create an instance. We use the class name scope resolution operator and call the methods and the properties. So that's all on this lecture on how to define and access static methods and static properties, and I'll see you in the next one. Hello and welcome to the lecture on understanding self keyword. So let's change this program and understand how to use this self keyword. Okay, so we can say, we can just remove this line. Okay, and what I want to do is I just want to call the add method and I want to print the result. Means I want to store the value in the result property. Okay, and we know we cannot use this. Okay, so far we know if you want to access the class property or class method inside the class, you can use this to access them. Because they are static in nature, they don't have an instance, you cannot use this. So how can we access a property of a class which are marked as static? Okay, that's where the self keyword come in picture. The self keyword is able to access the property without an instance. Okay, so now you can say this self is equal to this, and you don't have to return anything, and you can just change like this. Okay, using self you can access static methods and static properties. How we have used for $this to access a class property and a class method, similarly with self you can access static property and static methods inside the class. Okay, so let's execute this. So I'm trying to set this $result in this add method, and I'm just calling that add method and then I'm printing the result. Okay, so you can see the self is able to store that value in the result property, and then I'm able to call that property. Well, that's the benefit of using self inside the class, which help you to access static property and static methods. Okay, so I hope it's very clear when to use self keyword. Well, that's all about how to use the self keyword, and I'll see you in the next lecture. Hello and welcome to the lecture on use case of static method and properties. So let's understand in real life, where do you use static methods and properties? Well, utility class is again a good example of static class. We have seen in abstract class as well. Also, a static class could be a good example of a utility class, wherein sometimes you just want to store your method somewhere. Okay, because when you write in OOPs, you don't write functions or variables outside your class. You try to define everything inside your class. Even though it's not required to have inside a class, you still have to store inside the class, because everything in OOPs will be stored as a class. Okay, in some cases where you feel that you need to have a generic class, right? Some utility class wherein you just have your own helper methods. In those cases, you just create a static class and store all those methods and properties inside it, and you can access them without even creating an instance of it. Okay, so that's the beauty of having a static class. And a good example will be a utility class. Defining methods and properties as static, you can access them with the class name without creating an instance of it. Okay, instead of writing functions outside, you can write static class and define function inside it. So as I told you, when you're practicing OOPs, you don't write anything outside. Okay, in procedural language, we write everything as it is. We just define variables, methods, and just try to use them. Don't try to combine procedural and OOPs together. Okay, don't follow half of your program in OOPs and half of in procedural. When you write OOPs, just write OOPs. Okay, and the first thing that you have to write is thinking in objects, organizing in classes. That's what we have been learning. You have to define everything as a class, and you have to access them everything via an object. Okay, but static are exceptional for us. If you define the class methods and properties as static, you get this beautiful benefit of storing all those helper classes, utility classes, which you don't have a real life object, right? You just want to have a method somewhere stored in a class. Okay, this is a good example wherein you write your functions outside, you create a class and mark your methods as static. And most common use cases of static methods I told you are library functions and reusable code. Where you don't want to go ahead and create an instance, you can just use the scope resolution operator with the class name, and then you can directly use the methods of it. Let's do a file helper class and define some of the methods as static to understand what could be the use case of a static method and properties. So let's do an example now. So welcome to the lecture on use case of static methods. So we'll understand one real life use case of where you can use static methods. Okay, for this we'll create a file called file helper.php. And we create a class. Okay, and you just have a method called has content. Okay, let's say you have a method called has data, and then you pass in the file name, and it returns yes or no, true or false, saying that okay, it has data. Okay, so you have this kind of method where you really don't want to have a class and then define all the same methods in it. Maybe you want to combine different features of methods in one class. Okay, you simply define them as static, and you can just, instead of calling files, you can even call as helper class, and you can define all your methods in it. So it becomes very generic for you to use. You can define any helper methods in it. Okay, but for our example, we'll try to use files, and the way I want it to work is I want to echo the files helper, and I want to call has data, and I want to pass the file name. Okay, it has to just tell me if data is available or not. So what I want to do is, so I want to say if has data, I want to do something else, I want to do something else. Okay, so this is how I want to have my utility. Data found, data not found. Okay, and this is a very good helper class. You can use it anywhere you want to check whether there is any data in the file or not. Not the file exists, not the the file can be read or not, and no permissions and everything. You are checking inside the file whether the file has content or not. Okay, so let's quickly write that functionality. So the first thing is you want to check if file exists or not. Then you want to echo and you want to return false. Then you want to get the content, file get contents, and you want to check is empty. then you want to return false, else there is content, so you want to return true. Okay, so this is our file utility method which checks whether the file has data or not. Okay, so let's quickly run it because this file doesn't exist, so it will tell you file not data not found, and maybe the file does not exist. Okay, the text does not exist and data not found. So let's create a file. Some content, doesn't matter what is written there. Okay, it's just to check whether the file exists and has content. Okay, so data is found, right? And now the benefit of having this is you can use this anywhere in any of your project. Okay, so you're trying to build a library, and the best part is when you mention it as static, you don't have to worry about creating an instance, saving the instance, destroying the instance, constructor and everything. It's a method on its own, right? You're just, instead of just calling the method, right, typically in a procedural language you define the method and call it, right? It's just that you're attaching the class name. Okay, because it is static in nature, you can access with the scope resolution and you can access it without an instance. Okay, that's one of the real life example of where you want to build a library and you want to reuse in all your projects. You can create something like this, and static methods will help you do that. That's a real life example of when to use static, and I'll see you in the next one. Hello and welcome to the exercise section. So here is an exercise on static methods. You have to create a string operation helper static class, and here are the steps. You create a string helper class. You define a method called count vowel which accepts one parameter $content, which is a static method. Then you have to count number of vowels in this string. Okay, this string is passed here, then you have to return number of vowels in it. Okay, and write it as a static class, and then you call them without creating instance of it. Okay, so that's your exercise. Practice it so you'll understand how to work with static methods. Okay, so pause this video here and do this exercise. Okay, so welcome back. Let's create this exercise file. We have to define a static method count vowel. Okay, and how do you count vowel? You basically substring from the, you can substring and then you can count as well, right? You can substring and count. Then you can say this is my content and count number of A's. Okay, similarly you can count A, E, I, O, U. So A, E, I, O, U are the vowels. A, E, I, O, U. These are the vowels. Okay, so that's what we are counting inside the content. So now how do you call them? You just have to say class name, scope resolution operator, and you can say count vowel, and then you have to pass a string. So this is a string to count vowels. Okay, it will tell you number of A, E, I, O, U inside the string. So we need to have a semicolon here, and let's run this. Okay, there are 9 vowels inside the string. Okay, it's not more about how to write vowels, how to count vowels. It's more about you have to define a method as static and how do you call those methods. Okay, and it also help you to understand this is not something to do with an object, right? It's basically a counting vowel, and counting vowel, and you can have mix and match of methods defined in this helper class, and is a good way to see you can define some of the methods as static, and then you can start using these methods without creating an instance of it. Okay, So that is the exercise. I want you to also practice it. If you haven't done it, you can go ahead and try and do this exercise. Okay, so that's all on this lecture on exercise with static methods and properties, and I'll see you in the next one. Welcome to the assignment section. So in this assignment, you have to create a file operation class with some static methods. And if you don't know how to write file operations and you're not very familiar with files, you can go to this course, Ultimate PHP Basics for Absolute Beginners. Okay, and in this course you will actually learn about files, and this course is absolutely free, and it's a 16 hours of course. So you can, if you are struggling with how to work with files, then there's a section on files here. You can download that data as well. You can download that 200 PHP source code. You can also get the file in how this samples has been done. Take that file and basically you can go back and apply that static method. You can convert, that will be in a procedural language. You have to convert that into a class, and in the class you can define some of the methods as static, and then you start working with the file operations. Okay, so I leave you with what methods you want to define and how you want to define it. So try out this example, try out this assignment, and post your assignment so that I can review and give my feedback to you. Okay, so all the best for your assignment, and I'll see you in the next one. Hello and welcome to the summary section on static methods and properties. So by now you should be able to understand what is static methods and properties. You should be able to define and access static methods and its static properties. You should understand the self keyword, where and how to use it. Then you should understand a real life use case of static methods and properties and understand when you should use them. Okay, and I hope you have worked with exercises, resources, assignment, and taken the quiz to understand how to work with static methods and static properties. Okay, so that's all this lecture on static methods and properties, and I'll see you in the next one.